everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's lecture. My name is Asmaret Askerom. I'm the Associate Deputy Director of the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and I'll be your host today. Our guest speaker is Dr. Tom Mahnken, and his lecture is titled Countering the Axis of Authoritarianism. In recent years, and especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've seen increased cooperation among US adversaries, including Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, mostly in the form of material support such as sanctions evasion, defense equipment, weapons, and technologies. A couple months ago in February, CGSR held a workshop on this topic. The workshop summary you can actually find out on our website. Tom will elaborate on this issue while also providing recommendations on what the United States and the West can do to counter this authoritarian bloc. Tom has had a long career working on global security issues and defense policy. He is currently a member of the congressionally mandated National Defense Strategy Commission, president and CEO of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and a senior research professor at Johns Hopkins University. Also from 2006 to 2009, Tom served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy Planning. In terms of today's format, Tom will take the first half of the 90 minutes to present, and then we'll use the remaining time for the Q&A session. During his lecture, you can still start raising your hands electronically and typing your questions into the chat, and I'll get to them right when Tom is finished. With that said, Tom, it's a pleasure to have you. Welcome back to CGSR, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Asmaret. It's a real pleasure to be with you. It's even if it's a particular challenge to be with you first thing Monday morning on your end, right? But it's a real pleasure, and I'm thankful to be able to speak to you on this topic. It's an important topic because the challenges that we face today, although perhaps not unprecedented, certainly are far different than the challenges that we've faced in recent years or recent decades. And so what I'd like to do is first talk about, if you will, the basics of US interests, the basics of the adversaries that we face, and then talk a little bit about what that implies for a strategy to counter those adversaries. And hopefully in so doing, I'll set the table for a really good discussion to follow my presentation. So let's start with the basics. And these are basics, but they often, it seems to me, go without, they go kind of, they get passed over fairly lightly. The United States is a global power. We are not a super empowered regional power. We are a global power. And in tangible terms, that means that we have interests in at least three key theaters: Europe, Asia Pacific region, and the Middle East. And those interests are enduring. And what we've seen over time is various presidential administrations promote or demote various regions, right? It's been a trend really since the early 2000s that the United States is primarily interested in the Asia Pacific region. We could go all the way back to the George W. Bush administration. We could even perhaps go back before that. And note a strategic emphasis on the Asia Pacific region. At the same time, reality has a way of interfering with kind of the best laid plans of strategic planners. Just because the Asia Pacific region is the most consequential region, again, doesn't mean that it's the only region that's of importance to the United States. Again, we can see in the past where multiple administrations, I think, earnestly desired to reduce the U.S. footprint in the Middle East, for example, only to have that changed when adversaries, those who wish us ill, took actions that were against our interests and threatened our allies and our friends. Similarly, there was a period of time in the early 2000s when we believed earnestly and perhaps even correctly at the time that the U.S. could draw down its footprint in Europe. And Europe was much more seen as a place where U.S. forces would deploy from than the actual scene of deterrence operations or potentially combat operations. But the fact is that we do have three key theaters that are of great interest to the United States. Now, the constellation of adversaries that we face only heightens that geopolitical view. We face a series of adversaries: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Now, each of these adversaries resides in a region, but for none of these adversaries is their influence or their activities confined to that region, right? So, if we think about China, the challenge posed by China is not confined to the Asia-Pacific region, right? China is active in Europe. China is active in the greater Middle East. China is active in South America, in Africa, and the Arctic and Antarctic. So China is more and more a global competitor. Russia, even in a situation where Russia finds itself in dire circumstances at war in Eastern Europe, Russia is also present, right, in Africa, in the Middle East, elsewhere. So even if we were to focus on, say, the threat posed by Russia, that the Russian threat is not confined to Europe. Iran, similarly, Iran and the Iranian regime have been active in Europe. They're active in South America. They've even been active, certainly, in the United States, in efforts to target U.S. and U.S. officials, Iranian dissidents, and others. And North Korea, even for the the Hermit Kingdom, North Korea is active far beyond the Korean Peninsula. So we think about the three regions of vital concern to the United States. We think about the adversaries that we face. And here I'm focusing on the state-based adversaries. We would certainly talk about non-state actors as well. But those adversaries don't neatly even map onto those regions. They individually transcend those regions. That was the case even before those adversaries began to increasingly collaborate with one another. And so what we now see is a pattern of collaboration between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran that spans theaters. And I think there's plenty of examples that I could choose, but probably one of the most evocative examples is the fact that we have North Korean soldiers fighting on behalf of Russia in Eastern Europe. We're talking about that level of cooperation on the battlefield, and as CGSR has laid out recently, that's just the tip of the spear when it comes to this type of collaboration. Now, I would say that multiple administrations have sought to prevent the situation that we now find ourselves in. And I'd say most pointedly, multiple administrations sought earnestly to prevent a close alignment between Moscow and Beijing. And yet today, it is an accomplished fact, with Tehran and with Pyongyang thrown in as well. There are any number of strategies that could be taken to try to drive this axis of authoritarianism apart. and I hope we get to talk about that. But my starting point for my discussion today is that today it is an accomplished fact. So we should certainly do everything we can to try to break that axis of authoritarianism apart. But for now, it is a reality that we need to deal with. It's certainly true that the Trump administration appears to be trying to break this axis apart, trying to drive a wedge between Moscow and Beijing. And I would add, as previous administrations have tried and unfortunately failed to do, they're seeking to drive a wedge between Russia and China. I wish the Trump administration all the greatest success. I also wish them success dealing with North Korea and Iran. But again, where we are today, that axis of authoritarianism is an accomplished fact, and we need to treat it as such, and we need to think about how to counter it. I think that's particularly true when we consider the context for U.S. force planning. And the context for U.S. force planning is across the previous 3 administrations. We'll see if this administration changes it, but across the previous 3 administrations, across the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, and the Biden administration, the U.S. has had essentially a one-war force planning construct. That is, we plan to fight and win a war in one theater while deterring malign activity elsewhere. And part of my argument is that bipartisan force planning construct is increasingly out of touch with the world in which we find ourselves. A world where it's very difficult to isolate theaters from one another, where it's also very difficult to isolate an adversary's activities to a particular theater, and where it's increasingly difficult to isolate adversaries from one another. So I think where the situation we're in now is one where prudence dictates that we think about the possibility of multi-theater war and also war against multiple adversaries, and potentially multiple adversaries across multiple theaters. So that is a very dire situation indeed. Well, let me, having laid out a very dire situation, let me now lay out what I believe is the best way out of that situation, which is to call upon the fact that we, the United States, are fortunate to have some of the most capable countries as allies and as friends. And so the key to opposing this emerging axis of authoritarianism really is to strengthen our alliances, our partnerships with like-minded states across theaters. And just as our adversaries are increasingly collaborating with one another across theaters, we need to foster ways to work with our allies and our friends across theaters. In some ways, the Ukraine war has hinted at what this sort of robust collaboration would look like. And so what I'd like to do is talk about specifically what this counter coalition would look like and what needs to happen to really give it life. Let me start with what should be the easy stuff. And the easy stuff involves producing more of the types of capabilities that we already have. So one element where we need to be doing better, working with our allies, is in defense production. And if we think about that, and it's probably good to take munitions as a good case study for that, because munitions are not easy in the absolute sense, but relatively easy compared to other defense articles to produce. You need to produce them in great numbers, And it's an area where interoperability really does pay dividends. So in theory, we should have a munitions base that is sufficient to do three things. First, it should be sufficient to meet our own needs, that is the needs of the U.S. Armed Forces. Second, it should be sufficient to meet the needs of our allies and other countries who purchase munitions from the United States, right? We should have a large enough industrial base, not only to meet our own needs, but also to fulfill orders, purchases from US allies, friends, other customers. And then third, we should have enough capability to be able to help our friends when they are in need. Ukraine today, Taiwan potentially tomorrow. Now, I've laid out that ideal to contrast it with the situation we have today. Where the industrial base that we have today does not meet, is not capable today of meeting fully our needs, those of our allies and partners, and then of our friends. So we need to improve that, and there's a number of efforts underway to do that. But this is another area where allies can help. So we're not the only country that's making its munitions base more robust. So are a number of our key allies. Japan's investing a lot in munitions production. Australia, another example with their guided weapons and explosive ordnance enterprise. A number of the European states as well are investing in munitions. And what I would urge us to do is to think about that more and more as a shared pool of resources. In other words, the United States can do more, probably should do more to build up its munitions base for our own purposes, but also to supply them to our allies and our friends, but also to the extent that our allies can step up in munitions production, that alleviates what the U.S. Industrial base needs to do to support them. And also it opens up opportunities for us collectively to support our friends. Now, of course, that's easy to talk about, more difficult to implement. We can have a good conversation about why that winds up being difficult in practice. Some of that has to do with how poor the U.S. Department of Defense is as a customer for munitions. Part of it has to do with how tortured and arcane our foreign military sales process is. Part of it has to do with industry and industrial incentives. Part of it has to do with bureaucratic politics, organizational politics, and even domestic politics. But that's one area, a very tangible area, where we can and should do more to work closely with our allies. And again, working with our allies across theaters. And here's a good example where the Ukraine war has demonstrated the possibility of doing things better, right? Munitions going to Ukraine have come not just from Europe, not just from the United States, but also from suppliers in Asia and across the globe. And I think that's actually a very good model that we should follow as we move into the future. So number one has to do with defense production as an area where we should be working more closely with allies. Now I gave you the easy part of that, talked about munitions. Let's talk about the slightly less easy part of that, which has to do with defense exports and also, I'll say, defense imports. So here we're moving from the relatively easy, high volume, straightforward world of munitions, and now we're moving into the world of more advanced, expensive, highly capable, and more sensitive defense systems. So fighter aircraft, bombers, ships, ground systems. Here's another area where we need to be working more closely with our allies. And again, this is a two-sided problem. First, let's take it from the perspective of the United States. The United States produces some of the most capable, most effective defense systems in the world. However, we often make it difficult for our allies and others to purchase those systems. Some of them are not built for export. I'll say the F-22, no longer in production, but the F-22 fighter stands out as a poster child for an aircraft that was built, best I can tell, from the very beginning, never to be exported. And from the perspective of 2025, I have to say, or even the perspective of 2006, 2007, 2008, why would we possibly do that? With the exception of some very narrow areas where we're never going to export. Why should we design weapon systems without the possibility of export? Rather, I think what we should be doing is building in the possibility of export. And that goes not just for systems like F-22, but B-21 today, NGAD tomorrow. Just if we stick with combat aircraft, we really should be designing systems with a bias towards the possibility of export. Why? Because it offers the ability for us to equip our allies with the best material possible, gives them the opportunity to purchase the best equipment possible, and it also, if exported in sufficient quantities, also winds up being a good deal for the American taxpayer, that we can reduce unit costs through exports. And certainly there are good examples of that, right? The F-35 program, a truly multinational program, not only with a number of countries as investors and customers for the aircraft, but also a truly international maintenance and logistics infrastructure backing up the F-35. In a more narrow way, certainly what's being put in place for AUKUS between the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Similarly, working hand in glove with allies on advanced capabilities. Now that's challenging, right? It's challenging for a whole bunch of reasons, going from bureaucratic reasons, legislative, reasons, all sorts of things why it is challenging to build capabilities for export. But I think now is the time to have the conversation about sharing more, not sharing less with our allies. Let me flip it over because there's the flip side of this is also a challenging one. I said a few minutes ago that the United States produces some of the best weapon systems in the world. That's true, but it's also not true across the board. There are cases, and there are a number of areas where our allies and others actually have capabilities that are better than ours. One example has to do with shipbuilding, right? The US does an outstanding job of designing warships, but the US shipbuilding industry has seen better days. We have allies, fortunately, we have allies such as Japan and South Korea that do an outstanding job of shipbuilding to include warships. Where our allies have better solutions, we should be open to buying from allies. I say that knowing all the time that that there's all sorts of barriers to buying from allies, and those barriers have exhibited themselves across decades. But just as we should want our allies to purchase more from us, we should be open to purchasing more from them, again, particularly where they have a comparative advantage. Again, I'd love to discuss that further in the Q&A session. So Defense exports is a second area where we can and should do more than we're doing now to work closely with our allies and work closely across theaters. A third area has to do with basing and access. Part of the reason that the United States, or underpinning the fact that the United States is a global power, is the fact that we have a truly global basing network. And that basing network really does knit together the various theaters. So the ability to move forces between theaters, the ability to conduct global operations really is undergirded by basing. Some of that basing is on sovereign U.S. territory, whether the continental United States or U.S. territories in the Western Pacific, such as Guam. Other basing is on allied territory. And so basing is one of these areas where we should be working more closely with our allies. The Air Force is putting a lot of effort into what they call agile combat employment, essentially an effort for dispersed basing in the Western Pacific. The U.S. is funding the rehabilitation of a number of bases in the Western Pacific. Quite frankly, bases my father flew off of in World War II. That's all to the good, but if we're looking for distributed basing in the Western Pacific, we shouldn't ignore our allies. Japan. Let's start with Japan. Last time I checked, there were roughly 100 large civil airfields in the Japanese home islands. Japan self-defense forces have access to a small fraction of those, and we have access to a fraction of the airfields that the Japan self-defense forces have access to. If the United States is interested in coming up with distributed survivable basing infrastructure, we should be working more closely with allies such as Japan. Farther from the scene of a potential conflict in the Western Pacific, but also extremely important, is Australia. We look at Australia, and we look at Australia's Northern Territory, for example. We see not just the airfields that exist today, but you can still see the outlines of the literally dozens of airfields that existed in World War II. It's one of the nice things about the climate of Northern Australia relative to the Western Pacific, South Pacific Islands. Infrastructure tends to be preserved a little bit better in dry climates than in a jungle climate. So yeah, in World War II, U.S. forces and Allied forces, air forces operated out of literally dozens of airfields in Northern Australia. And so we should be thinking about increasing basing there. We need to be thinking about ways to knit together the various theaters of interest to us, and doing that with our allies. And then finally, is strategy. And this may sound like a very orthogonal idea given the world that we seem to be living in right now, but we need to be doing more to work closely with our allies when it comes to strategy. In a world where we face multiple adversaries active across multiple theaters, we need to be working more closely with our allies to determine how we can support each other, what we can do for each other, and also what we don't want to, are unable to do for each other. That becomes all the more important. Long past a period where conflicts are likely to be confined to a small geographic area, just a couple of actors, and short, sharp conflicts, what we're likely to face more and more are protracted conflicts involving more and more players, and potentially spreading geographically and also escalating vertically. So that puts strategy back really into the forefront. And that strategy in today's world to have any chance of effectiveness needs to involve not just us, but also our allies and our partners. Again, there's all sorts of barriers to doing this, but at least in the case of strategy development, we do have decades of experience to build off of, whether in a European context, in an Asian context, even in a Middle East context. The key here, though, is how to knit those various efforts together with our allies and with our partners. So, having laid out this vision may seem kind of like a pipe dream to some. I'll end it here, and then I'd like to turn it over for questions and comments and provocations. You can tell me where you think I'm wrong, and I'd love to carry the conversation forward that way. So, Asmaret, back over to you.